On the morning of September 10, 1940, off the Pas-de-Calais coast near Cap Gris-Nez, German naval officers aboard patrol vessels operating in the English Channel noticed something deeply unsettling. There were no British destroyers on the horizon, no cruisers, no visible naval presence at all. Yet within minutes, heavy shells began crashing into the water around them with disturbing accuracy. Columns of spray rose higher than the masts. One shell landed so close it rocked a patrol boat hard enough to injure crewmen on deck. The firing was deliberate, ranged, and methodical, and it was coming from land. By late summer 1940, the German Navy had grown accustomed to fighting the Royal Navy at sea. What they had not expected was that Britain's coastline itself had become a weapon. Massive coastal artillery batteries, many of them modernized versions of First World War guns, now dominated key stretches of the channel. These guns were not relics. They were integrated into a dense network of observation posts, radar stations, range-finding equipment, and fire control centers that allowed British gunners to strike targets far beyond visual range. From the German perspective, this created a uniquely dangerous problem. Warships could maneuver against enemy vessels. They could evade, return fire, or retreat under cover of smoke. Against coastal guns, none of those options worked reliably. The batteries were immobile but heavily protected, buried in concrete, camouflaged into cliffs, and supported by redundant systems. Naval guns, even from destroyers, struggled to suppress them. Air attacks were risky and often inaccurate. And unlike ships, these batteries could not be sunk. German after-action reports from the Channel Zone repeatedly described engagements in which ships were fired upon by guns they could not see, from positions they could not neutralize, while operating in waters that had once been considered relatively safe. Even light patrol craft and minesweepers were forced to alter routes, hug coastlines at night, or avoid certain sectors entirely during daylight hours. The psychological effect was immediate. British coastal sectors became dead zones, areas where German commanders knew they were exposed even in the absence of enemy ships. This fear was not based on isolated incidents. It reflected a broader strategic reality that was becoming clear by the autumn of 1940. Britain had effectively extended its naval power ashore, turning fixed artillery into a substitute fleet. Control of the sea was no longer determined only by ships at sea, but by guns on land that could reach far into contested waters. As German naval planners began reassessing their operations in the Channel, the realization set in that Britain's coastal guns were not merely defensive installations, but a decisive factor reshaping naval warfare in the narrow seas. By 1939, Britain's coastal gun network was not an improvised response to war, but the product of decades of planning shaped by geography and bitter experience. The First World War had already demonstrated how vulnerable the British Isles were to naval bombardment and blockade. In the interwar years, while much public attention focused on air defense, the War Office quietly maintained and upgraded a ring of coastal artillery guarding the approaches to major ports, anchorages, and narrow sea lanes. When war returned in September 1939, these defenses were rapidly expanded and modernized. Older guns, some dating back to the previous war, were refurbished with improved barrels, recoil systems, and ammunition. More importantly, they were integrated into a coordinated fire control system that transformed static guns into precision instruments. Optical rangefinders, some with baselines exceeding 30 feet, allowed gunners to calculate distance and bearing with remarkable accuracy. These were linked to plotting rooms where crews tracked enemy movement and issued firing solutions in real time. The real advantage, however, lay in integration. Coastal batteries did not operate in isolation. They were connected to Royal Navy intelligence, coastal radar stations, and the Observer Corps. By 1940, early warning radar such as the chain-home low system could detect low-profile targets moving through the channel, cueing gun crews long before ships were visible from shore. Even when radar contact was intermittent, visual spotting posts along cliffs and headlands relayed bearing corrections by telephone. This meant that German vessels could be tracked, ranged, and engaged without warning, often before they realized they were under observation. The physical construction of the batteries made them exceptionally difficult to neutralize. Gun emplacements were sunk deep into reinforced concrete, with magazines, power supplies, and command rooms protected underground. Camouflage nets, false cliffs, and decoy positions complicated aerial reconnaissance. While German aircraft attempted bombing raids against several sites, hits were rare and damage was usually superficial. Repairs could be made quickly, often within hours. For German naval commanders, this posed a problem their doctrine was not designed to solve. Naval gunnery relied on maneuver and counterfire. Coastal guns offered neither target mobility nor exposure. Even heavy ships lacked the elevation and accuracy to engage well-protected shore batteries effectively, especially while under return fire. The result was a growing recognition that Britain's coastal defenses had created zones of control that functioned much like invisible fleets. As German ships continued to operate in the Channel, this realization forced a reevaluation of what it meant to face British naval power, even when the sea itself appeared empty. The impact of Britain's coastal guns on German naval operations became increasingly visible as the Channel Campaign intensified in late 1940 and into 1941. German commanders quickly learned that these batteries were not simply static defenses guarding ports, but active participants in the contest for control of the narrow seas. Their presence reshaped day-to-day operations in ways that rarely appeared in public communiques but were carefully noted in internal reports. Routine tasks such as minesweeping became hazardous undertakings. Minesweepers, slow-moving and lightly armed, were especially vulnerable. British coastal gunners learned to recognize their distinctive movement patterns and would often open fire once a sweep was detected. German records show repeated instances where minesweeping operations had to be abandoned after coming under accurate shellfire from shore positions the crews could neither see nor silence. This forced German units to conduct more operations at night, increasing navigational risk and reducing efficiency. Patrol craft and escort vessels faced similar challenges. Schnellboot, fast attack boats designed for speed and surprise, were theoretically ideal for Channel warfare. Yet even these craft were constrained by the reach of British guns. During daylight hours, operating within range of major batteries invited detection and engagement. German crews began hugging the French coastline or restricting movements to narrow corridors where British fire was less concentrated. The result was a predictable pattern of movement that British planners could anticipate and exploit. The most serious implication of all emerged during planning for Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Britain. German naval staff recognized that transporting troops across the Channel would require hours of exposure in slow, unarmored barges. British coastal batteries covering likely crossing points posed a lethal threat to such formations. Unlike ships, barges could not maneuver effectively, disperse rapidly, or withstand near misses. Even a small number of well-placed shells could cause catastrophic losses. Studies conducted by German naval planners concluded that without first neutralizing Britain's coastal guns, any invasion attempt would face unacceptable risk. Air power alone could not guarantee their destruction. Naval gunfire was insufficient. The guns could be repaired, replaced, or simply continue firing from alternative positions. As one internal assessment noted, coastal batteries represented a fixed but persistent danger that could not be eliminated quickly enough to support an amphibious assault. This realization contributed significantly to the gradual sidelining of Sea Lion as a viable operation. While air superiority and logistical challenges are often emphasized, the role of coastal artillery is less frequently acknowledged. Yet for German naval officers tasked with making the crossing possible, Britain's guns on land were among the most daunting obstacles of all. By turning the Channel into a contested firing zone rather than an open sea, Britain's coastal defenses imposed limits that German planners could not overcome by naval means alone. As the war progressed into 1941 and 1942, Britain's coastal guns took on a second, less obvious role that further unsettled German naval planners. Beyond denying freedom of movement, they reshaped how the Royal Navy allocated its limited surface forces. Every stretch of coastline dominated by heavy artillery effectively reduced the need for constant naval patrols, freeing destroyers and escorts for duties elsewhere. For German commanders watching British ship deployments, this created a deceptive picture. Areas that appeared lightly defended at sea were, in reality, under constant threat from shore. This was particularly significant in the fight against German fast attack craft. E-boats relied on surprise, speed, and coastal darkness to strike convoys moving through the channel. But in sectors covered by British batteries, their freedom of action was sharply curtailed. Coastal guns, guided by radar and observation posts, could engage E-boats as they assembled or withdrew, forcing them to operate further offshore or delay attacks until conditions were ideal. The presence of shore-based fire support meant that even when British escorts were thin, convoys enjoyed a layer of protection that German planners could not easily counter. German reports from this period reflect growing frustration. Attacks that should have been routine became unpredictable. Routes once considered usable were suddenly interdicted. Even the psychological strain on crews became a factor. Knowing that they were operating within range of unseen guns, capable of firing accurately from miles away, eroded confidence. Crews spoke of the coastline itself as hostile, an extension of the enemy rather than neutral terrain. The British, meanwhile, continued refining their system. Fire control techniques improved. Communications between naval command, radar stations, and gun batteries became faster and more reliable. Coastal artillery units trained specifically to engage moving maritime targets rather than fixed bombardment points. This adaptability meant that Britain's guns remained relevant even as naval and air technology advanced. By 1943, German naval activity in the Channel had diminished significantly. Losses mounted, operational payoff declined, and priorities shifted toward defending occupied ports and supporting operations elsewhere. Coastal batteries did not win the naval war on their own, but they altered its geometry. They imposed costs, restricted choices, and forced Germany to expend resources countering a threat that could not be decisively removed. In effect, Britain had achieved a strategic economy of force. By anchoring power ashore, it maintained pressure at sea without constant presence. For German warships, the absence of British vessels no longer meant safety. It meant uncertainty, and the ever-present possibility that the next shell would come from the land itself. By the time Allied planners began preparing for the return to Western Europe, Britain's coastal guns had entered a final and often overlooked phase of their wartime role. In 1943 and early 1944, many of the same batteries that had once terrified German patrol craft were incorporated into a much larger operational system designed to support the Normandy landings. Their purpose was no longer simply denial, but control. Along the Channel coast, British artillery units rehearsed counter-battery fire, coordination with naval forces, and rapid target acquisition. Intelligence gathered over years of engagement allowed planners to map German movements, predict likely responses, and designate firing zones with precision. On D-Day itself, coastal guns helped suppress German shore positions, engaged enemy vessels attempting to interfere with the landings, and denied German naval units freedom to maneuver in the narrow seas. Their presence reduced the risk of surprise attacks from ports and coastal routes that might otherwise have threatened the invasion fleet. For German commanders, this confirmed a lesson learned too late. Coastal guns had not been a temporary wartime expedient, but a durable element of British sea control. Even as air power and submarines dominated public discussion of the naval war, fixed artillery quietly constrained German options year after year. By the time the invasion came, Germany no longer possessed the freedom to contest the Channel directly. The narrow seas had been shaped, conditioned, and dominated long before the first landing craft crossed. After the war, many of these batteries were dismantled or abandoned, their concrete emplacements left to erode along the cliffs. Yet their strategic impact remains clear. Britain had transformed geography into force. Without ships at sea, without visible presence, it imposed control through preparation, integration, and patience. German warships learned to fear not what they could see, but what they could not strike. The Channel, often described as a natural moat, became something far more deliberate. It was a defended zone, engineered to punish exposure and reward caution. And in that environment, British coastal guns proved that naval power does not always sail under a flag. Sometimes, it waits in silence, fixed in stone, shaping the battle long before the enemy realizes the sea is already lost. If you found this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of World War II naval warfare valuable, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and enabling notifications. More detailed, source-driven documentaries are coming, each exploring how overlooked systems quietly shaped the outcome of the war.